All done, Judy? Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the South London Israel Forum. This talk is called Inspiring Jewish and Zionist Pride, Rebuilding a People, and it's with Ben M. Friedman. Ben Friedman is an author and internationally renowned educator focusing on Jewish identity, combating anti-Semitism, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. His new book is called Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. Ben grew up in the isolated Jewish community of Glasgow, what he calls the diaspora of the diaspora. It was an active Jewish and Zionist community. He went to university to study for an MA in politics after the infamously anti-Semitic UN conference in Durban, where Zionism was equated to racism. This led to things like Israel Apartheid Week and just generally a more hostile environment for Jews in universities. Ben joined UJIA and he was the only out Jew at the time. This tested how comfortable he was with his identity, and it was a baptism of fire, but it taught him how to defend himself at a time when the Jewish community was still sticking to the philosophy of keep your head down. So he was in a position where he had been accepted as a gay man, but rejected as a Jew. Ben went to Hong Kong, where he became director of Holocaust education at a Hong Kong Holocaust Center, and he's head of humanities at a school and teaches about anti-Semitism. He's been to Auschwitz 7 times and lectures on the history of anti-Semitism at universities. In 2018, Ben joined the online fight with British Jews against the institutionally anti-Semitic Labour Party. And that fight is something he considers a template for the diaspora all over the world. Ben thinks that Jewish identity should be like gay identity, something to be proud of and without victimhood defining us. Ben educates, inspires, and empowers Jews to take pride in their identity. So it's over to Ben Friedman.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's a very nice introduction. And I promise that in my school, I have a reputation for teaching depressing subjects. And when you reel off my CV like that, it does sound like I'm a little morbid, but I promise this will be an enjoyable conversation. So firstly, hello to you all. Hello to also Adam and Judith and Ged, some people I know, some friendly faces. I have published my first book. It came out on Monday. It's called Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. And I want to tell you a little bit about that, a little bit about the inspiration behind it and why I think that we as a people, as a Jewish community, are in desperate need of a pride movement. Perhaps less so in Britain, because as Alex said, I do think that the way the British Jewish community responded to the threat that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party posed is a model of pride to the global Jewish community, particularly countries like America. But my journey to Jewish pride began in Glasgow with my parents. I was a member of a reform school, and my parents worked incredibly hard to create a proud Jewish home. And my father passed away a few years ago, but I've been speaking to my mother, obviously, about my childhood and the choices that she and my father made. And I realized that they succeeded. Both of my siblings made Aliyah. My brother served in the IDF for 10 years, and I've just written a book about Jewish pride. So they clearly did something right. So we really all owe them a huge debt of gratitude. And even though we lived in a very small community, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Glasgow Jewish community or the Scottish Jewish community, but it's very small. There's about 5,000 of us, and we all basically live in one area. There were 5 Jewish families in my street. And as I said, my parents worked incredibly hard to make sure that we were proud Jews, despite the fact there was only one Jewish primary school, no Jewish high school. The universities were not the Junies that exist in England. They were not Birmingham or Leeds or Manchester. In fact, they were quite the opposite. Glasgow University, where I went, was, as Alex said, deeply anti-Semitic. But I have to say, when looking back on my Jewish identity, I can't say that I felt pride because it was all that I knew. I never considered anything else. My family were Jewish. Most of my friends were Jewish. The people I saw outside of school anyway. But that changed when I went to university. From 2004, 2005, I went to Israel on a gap year with RSY Netzer. and spent a year learning about Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and from quite a progressive perspective. RSY stands for Reform Synagogue Youth. No, it's RSY Netzer, No Art Tzionit Reformé, so Reform Zionist Youth. So it's quite a progressive organization, quite left of center. But when I went to university, I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned at how I was treated because I was a Jew. I was regularly called a racist. I was called a white supremacist, an imperialist, a colonizer. I had to endure the fact that, as Alex said, I was basically the only out Jew, I think, in the whole of the university, actually. And I would regularly hear people who were supposed to be my friends saying things like Yasser Arafat was their hero. And this was incredibly isolating. And I have to be honest, incredibly distressing. And now I recognize that those were the seeds sprouting that eventually led to Corbyn. Now, the seeds have been in British academia for a long time. It didn't start when I was there, but certainly it was the same rhetoric that Jeremy Corbyn espoused 10 or so years later. But a funny thing happened when I was at university. Well, I mean, it's actually not that funny, to be honest. I realized that I was gay. And I saw two different responses from my university, my peers. On one hand, with regards to my sexual orientation, they embraced me. They accepted me, they encouraged me, empowered me. My friends would try and sign me up for dating sites. They would want me to go to gay bars with them. But when it came to Jewishness or Zionism, I was rejected. And I saw the hypocrisy of the left firsthand. And I think this is not just my experience. Many, many LGBTQ plus Jews report the same instances of anti-Semitism on one hand and acceptance embracement on the other. So I, in a way, put my Jewishness on a backseat. I really had suffered from a lot of mental health difficulties as a young person. I struggled with coming out. So the priority was to deal with my LGBTQ plus identity. And I did. I went on a long road to Pride. And that's something that's important to consider about the book, is that Pride is a journey, and Pride involves work, and it has to be work that we decide to do. It doesn't just happen. And in a way, I decided to go on my journey to Pride because I had no choice. And I went on and I continued as a proud Jew, although not again considering my identity. And I really began to consider my identity as a Jew and what that meant when, as Alex said, I joined some of you in the online fight against Jeremy Corbyn. And it really was incredibly inspiring. I think that we have real heroes in our community who stood up and refused to be silenced and understood our basic right to advocate for ourselves and understood our basic right for allyship, that all other communities are given and afforded, but not us. And I do think the way that we as a community overcame our differences, put our differences aside to come together is kind of amazing. As someone who grew up in the Reform community in Glasgow, seeing an Orthodox rabbi or seeing Orthodox rabbis sign letters or be co-signatories in letters with liberal rabbis, Reform rabbis, majority or conservative rabbis was really remarkable. But it shows the basic understanding that we as Jews had, that the differences that divide us were not nearly as great as the threat that we faced from the outside world. But I also noticed something at the same time, which I found very troubling. And there were specific Jewish people, often specific high-profile Jewish people, who were suffering from what I call the hangover of the keep your head down policy. And this, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, was this idea of keep your head down, don't say anything, just get on with it. I was told that constantly as a young person, and I've never been able to do it. I've never been able to keep my head down. And I think on one hand, my parents were very happy about that. And I think on the other hand, they wished I would be quiet at certain points. But I couldn't be quiet. I could not stop talking about anti-Semitism when I saw it so regularly. But I saw there were Jews who were suffering. When I say they were suffering, that's my perception of them. They certainly were not comfortable speaking up. They certainly were not comfortable necessarily accepting the problem that was quite clearly present. And this made me reflect on my own journey. And for any of you who are online, you know what happens when a Jewish person's online, when a Jewish person speaks about their Jewishness online. We're met with a barrage of intense, violent anti-Semitism from both the left and the right. So it's, in some ways, Jewish people are quite unifying to the outside world, to the anti-Semite. For example, when I published, or when I reported that my book was about to come out, I had people on the left saying, well, your book is just about white pride. And I had people on the right saying, well, if Jews can have pride, why can't white people? So the contradictions never fail to amaze. But I saw fundamentally that the non-Jewish world had appropriated, had stolen, had bastardized Jewish identity. And what they attempted to do was define our identity for us. So while I'm a Jew, and obviously an incredibly proud Jew, I'm not particularly religious. I identify more with the peoplehood, with the ethnicity, the culture, the heritage, the history. And I know that obviously the religion is a part of that. But when I say Kaddish for my late father, or when I light Shabbat candles, I'm not doing it because of God personally. I'm doing it to connect with all of you and to our history. And that is just as legitimate. But I'm constantly told, and have been constantly told by non-Jewish people specifically, that no, you're a religion. You're just a religion. There's no other aspect to your identity. And when I say, well, actually, that's not necessarily true, we're kind of a complicated thing and there's different aspects to us, I'm told, no, you're just a religion. Which I find baffling. I find baffling that non-Jewish people would attempt to define my identity when the same people who are heterosexual would never attempt to define my identity as a gay man. So I wrote an article about reclaiming Zionism. Zionism was one of the aspects of Jewish experience or Jewish identity that I saw the non-Jewish world bastardize and warp. Because what is Zionism? Zionism is the movement of self-determination to return the Jewish people to their indigenous homeland, the land of Israel. That's the basic definition. And of course, because Jews are Jews and we don't necessarily agree on everything, there's multiple interpretations of that. How much land we should have, should we share it or not? But the basic premise stays the same. A movement of self-determination to return the Jewish people to their indigenous homeland after 2,000 years of expulsion, ethnic cleansing, genocide, legal persecution, and much more. Zionism was created by Jews for Jews, and it has always been a part of Jewish identity. There is an image of an ancient synagogue from Cordoba in Spain from the 14th century. And it says, we're going to resurrect, we're going to build the synagogue so we can be returned to the Holy Land to rebuild the temple. That is an expression of Zionism. It may be pre-Zionism Zionism, but it's an expression of Zionism. And I actually do not believe that it's possible to separate Jewishness or Judaism from Zionism. Zionism is inherent to Jewish identity, as far as I'm concerned anyway. But I saw the non-Jewish world try and turn it into something else. They said it was white supremacy, like I was called at university. They said it was imperialism, colonialism, representative of evil. And that to me was just unacceptable. Not only was it unacceptable what they were saying because it was false and it was rooted in deep anti-Semitic rhetoric, but it was unacceptable because they were stealing our concepts and then they were turning our concepts against us. So I wrote this article about reclaiming Zionism and someone said to me, you should turn it into a book. And I, in a very Scottish way, was like, oh, go away. Like, there's no way I could write a book. I'm an educator, a speaker, I'm certainly not a writer. And I still stand by that, even though I now am a published author. But I think they're slightly separate. But it really got me thinking. It got me thinking that we as a community are in desperate need of a Jewish Pride movement. I get messages all the time on Instagram from people, and they say to me, this is the worst anti-Semitism has ever been. And I say, well, obviously it's not the worst it's ever been, for obvious reasons. But I'm 34 years old, and this is the worst I've ever seen it. It's the worst I've ever seen it in my life. And my dad, I begin my book with a quote from my late father. And he used to always say to me, Ben, the non-Jewish world hates Jews. And he fundamentally was not saying that non-Jewish people hate Jews. He was saying the non-Jewish world, culture, society, ideology. And we would argue. As I said to you, I could never be quiet. I was always a little bit mouthy, a little bit obnoxious, perhaps. And we would fight. We would fight across the table on Shabbat. And I'd be like, no, Dad, you're wrong. They're not. They don't hate us anymore. Things have changed. And I have realized since his passing and since the return of overt anti-Semitism that actually he was right. What I experienced at the beginning of my life was the exception, not the rule. The rule is that Jewish people face systemic, deeply embedded anti-Semitic hate for generations and have done for thousands of years. And when reflecting on my journey to LGBTQ pride and homophobia, just as I understand that homophobia is not actually a gay problem, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Clearly, it is a problem which impacts us, but it is not a problem which originates in our community. It's a problem which originates out with our community, outside our community in the non-Jewish world. So with that basic understanding, that then influences how we can play a part in the fight against anti-Semitism. And while it's not necessarily our problem, we do have a role to play. We dialogue, we share our experiences, we exchange, we communicate, we lead. But if it's not our problem, and really, if the work to dismantle it has to be done by the non-Jewish world, then what do we do with our time? What we need to do is build a Jewish pride movement. Something I believe that we as a community are very good at is talking about our dead. We talk about the Shoah, we talk about the pogroms. There's other experiences we talk about less, the Farhud, the pogrom against Iraqi Jews in 1941, the expulsion of the Sephardic Jews in the 15th century. But those are the types of things we focus on. What we don't focus on, what we don't talk about, much to our detriment, is the shame and the trauma that anti-Semitism inflicts on us. The shame and the trauma imposed on us by an anti-Semitic non-Jewish world. I'm not going to tell you how you feel. I can talk about how I feel. And I believe that I, like many young Jews and many other Jewish people, suffer from intergenerational trauma. I suffer from trauma watching the collective Jewish people's experience today. And I also have been shamed and traumatized by anti-Semitic instances that have affected me personally. This is a lot to deal with. But as I said, to our detriment, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about how anti-Semitism impacts us emotionally. When my father passed away, I cared for him in the last 6 months of his life with my mother. And it was, as you can imagine, a very painful experience. But I said to my partner after he passed away that I want to move forward, not move on, but move forward as well as possible, as whole as possible. I didn't want to be broken or fractured because of this experience. I didn't want to carry it with me for the rest of my life. I wanted to honor my father, but I wanted to be emotionally well and healthy. And although that was regarding a very specific experience with a son losing his father, I believe that the same idea applies to us as a people. It doesn't matter what type of trauma or shame or embarrassment we're dealing with, whether it's incredibly personal or as part of a collective. It impacts us. And we have seen Jewish people try time and time again to avoid anti-Semitism. Partly we keep our heads down. But we also change our names. My last name is Freeman. I'm sure you're all aware that that was not my original last name. My mum's last name was Samuels. Her maiden name was Samuels. Originally, that was Shmulevitz. We changed our names. We change our faces. We change our cultural practices, our connection with one another. And we're afraid to tell people that we're Jewish. We say, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to keep my head down. But I think that has done us damage. And there is a very clear difference between being shamed and being ashamed. And while the non-Jewish world will try to shame us, and actually I believe there's not an enormous amount we can do to stop them, what we can do is refuse to absorb their shame and become ashamed. We have to stand as proud Jews. We have to reject the shame of anti-Semitism. We have to build our own barriers against internalized anti-Semitism, which is a very big problem in our community. And the barriers to that are Jewish pride and Zionist pride, instilling in people that actually we're each a tapestry. No, rather not, we're not a tapestry, we're a thread. We're a thread in a tapestry that connects us not only to each other, but also 5,000 years of history. We should not allow the non-Jewish world to define our identities. We should not allow the non-Jewish world to tell us what we are. And it's not to say, of course, that there will necessarily be a consensus, even in this room. I will have my Jewish identity and you will have yours, and that's fine. And we will have disagreements, debates, arguments, and that's actually part of Jewish tradition. I mean, look at the Talmud. But these disagreements, these debates are ours to have. The non-Jewish world should not be involved in these discussions. They can listen. They can have, observer status, so they can learn more about our experience, so they can become allies, so they can advocate for us. But to be quite honest, non-Jewish perceptions of Jewish identity are irrelevant. Non-Jewish perceptions of Jewish concepts like Zionism are irrelevant. These were concepts created by Jews for Jews. And I think the Jewish community is at a crossroads. As I said, in my life, this is the worst anti-Semitism that I've ever seen. And we have to take a little bit of a step back. And that's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard when you're in the thick of it and you're receiving a barrage of anti-Semitism constantly. It's very hard to take a step back. But we have an enormous responsibility in our hands, because not only are we defending ourselves, we're defending the entire Jewish people, the concept of a Jewish people. If we don't educate our youth about their authentic identities, then how can we expect the Jewish people to continue for another 5,000 years? If we don't guard against internalized anti-Semitism, which infect universities all over the world, or rather anti-Semitism affects universities all over the world, and there are Jewish students on these campuses who are internalizing this anti-Semitism, then how can we ensure the Jewish people will continue for another 5,000 years? I really believe we're at a crossroads, and I'm selling a book and I've written this book, so clearly I believe in it, but it's more than the book. It's about the message. The only way forward for us is with Jewish pride. We have to reject internalized anti-Semitism, and we also have to reject assimilation. Assimilation is very different from integration. Integration is when we have hyphenated identities. So I'm a Scottish Jew, an English Jew, an Irish Jew, a British Jew, whatever. Bye, Adam. It's not to shed our Jewishness to be accepted. It's not to say, okay, I'm no longer Jewish, I'm British, and hope that will lead anti-Semitism to be destroyed and defeated. And we should integrate with our societies. I mean, you can tell me if this still happens, but in Scotland, in the synagogues, they say a prayer for the royal family every Shabbat. Is that something that still happens with your shul? Yeah. I mean, I literally know it off by heart. We do that. Why? Because we're showing to the crown, we're showing to Britain that we're loyal Brits. We may be Jews, but we're loyal. But something we have to consider is, while we give our loyalty, while we give our support, being proud of our Jewish identity should also mean that we can demand support in return, that we can demand respect in return. Because a major component of Jewish pride is understanding the right that we have to advocate for ourselves. We have to reject this notion of keep your head down. Not only because it is not rooted in pride, it's rooted in shame, but also on a more practical level, it just didn't work. We have to hold our heads high. We have to be proud of our Jewishness, proud of our Zionism, and interact with the non-Jewish world, but not as a people begging to be accepted, as proud Jews. In my book, in the last chapter, the book is many things. It's a little bit historical, it's a little bit memoir, psychological, theoretical, but the last chapter is kind of a blueprint to Jewish pride. So I talk about our identity. I talk about solving intercommunal Jewish issues like misogyny, homophobia, addressing these problems. I talk about celebrating Jewish memory, promoting Jewish action, celebrating Jewish achievement. I mean, the fact that we don't talk about the fact that 20% of Nobel Prize winners are Jewish is mad. That is an unbelievable achievement. And I know why we don't talk about it, because we're going to be accused of being wealthy and powerful, so we keep our heads down. But if we take a step back and realize that every person who is born a Jew is the direct descendant of people who have survived ethnic cleansings and genocides, multiple, and that 20% of Nobel Prize winners are still Jewish, that is remarkable. And it is something we should teach our children, not so that they feel superior, but that they understand the beauty and the power in the community that they're part of, and so that they in turn feel empowered. But I end this chapter by saying, love our humor, love our food, love our culture, love our music. Because, as I've said several times, I knew that when people reading this chapter, one of the major points of feedback was going to be, but you haven't mentioned this thing about Jewish identity, or that thing about Jewish identity. And of course, my publishers had to stop me writing. The book is already long, and you have to stop writing at some point, right? But the beauty of our peoplehood is that we're so diverse, is that we can all celebrate our Jewishness in different ways. Many of us, that will be proudly proclaiming to the public that we're Zionist. To others, it might simply be lighting the Shabbat candles or keeping kosher. And each is just as legitimate as the next. But the most important thing is, however we express it, is that we come together to protect one another, to inspire one another, to empower one another, and to educate one another, and to build a Jewish pride movement. And as I said, that is the only option available to us. It's the only way forward. And I know that I'm speaking, perhaps in some ways, I'm speaking to the choir, right? I'm preaching to the choir. I know that this is a Zionist organization, so you don't need me to convince you to be Zionist, obviously. But I do think that even if we identify as proud Jews, these messages are important. I wrote the book and I need the book. I'm put in situations every week when I'm at school. I'm working with very progressive, non-Jewish Americans who have very specific perspectives of my identity, very specific perspectives of what it means to be oppressed, of the power dynamics. And they constantly try to shame me, to say, oh, you talk about Jewish issues too much. It's like, yeah, that's like my main thing. Of course I do. But though they try to shame me, I refuse to let them make me feel ashamed. So I think now we can open the floor to questions and a discussion or comments. I would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback.
Thank you so much, Ben. What a powerful talk. And thank you so much, Judy, for organising this as well, Judy Ledominski. So, well, I'll get the ball rolling with the questions, if that's okay. I always think that people like supporting people who help themselves. No one ever stops for someone next to a broken down car, but if you push your car down the street, people will hop out and join in, won't they? And I think it's the same with this, really. And that's why the British Jewish community was so successful in fighting Labour anti-Semitism, is that we helped ourselves. And on that, I would like to ask you, in terms of, so we need to take responsibility, as you mentioned. How can young people and parents of young people prepare themselves for the rocky road ahead, specifically with universities? We've all heard about certain lecturers such as David Miller, who've been making Jewish students feel very uncomfortable during lectures, and he's not the only one. So how do you prepare young people for that, whether you be the parent or the young person?
I think it's a really excellent question, and it's one that I'm asked quite a lot, and I think it's quite a tricky answer. And I think ultimately it has to be a multi-pronged response. Firstly, there has just to be a culture of empowerment, a culture of Jewish pride. So we have to, as a collective, do away with keep your head down. We have to celebrate people who raise their voices up, talk about the unbelievable achievements of the British Jewish community as a shining example of pride globally. But I also think we have to have very honest conversations. Very honest conversations. No one ever said to me before, I don't know if my parents knew, to be honest, but no one ever said to me before I went to Glasgow, oh, it might be a bit rough. It might be hard. So the first time I was called a racist, when I told someone I'd just come back from a gap year in Israel, I was floored. And it was like a punch to the gut. So I think we have to have sensitive conversations with our young people, preparing them for the outside world, and not in a way which scares them, not in a way which constantly puts them on the defensive, but says to them, listen, this is what might happen, but they're wrong. And what's more, they're racist. Something that I find particularly empowering, as someone online, I get a lot of anti-Semitic messages, sometimes death threats. And people always say to me, oh, how do you cope with that? And I was like, well, they're just a bunch of racists. And naming something is incredibly powerful. When I was at uni, I didn't name it. I didn't know what it was in 2005. Now, I say, okay, they were racist. And I think naming something, perhaps like, you know, with regards to Harry Potter, if we don't name something, if we don't name Voldemort, it becomes even more frightening. We have to name it. We have to say, this is what it is. Your instincts are correct. Do not allow people to tell you differently. Do not believe the gaslighting, but also fundamentally arm them with knowledge. So do our young people know that we're indigenous to the land of Israel? Do they know why we left the land of Israel? Do they know about Jewish culture? Do they know that Ashkenazi Jews settled in Europe, but are not indigenous to Europe? And this basic knowledge also can be a kind of armor. But ultimately, if you're a lone Jewish student on campus, it's very, very difficult.
Thank you. And I think Corinne has a question. Corinne, would you like to ask it yourself? If you unmute yourself.
That's okay, Alex. You can ask it for me, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So what Corinne wants to know is, not everyone is as articulate and knowledgeable as you. Do you have 3 practical tips for people to use?
I would say they're all rooted in knowledge, and it would be understanding specific things. So understanding basic Jewish history, and I mean in terms of our origins, not in terms of necessarily anti-Semitism. So as I said, understanding, 1, that we're indigenous to the Levant. Number 2 would be understanding that anti-Semitism did not start or end with the Holocaust, because that is something that is kind of put out and is taught, which is it's just false. And number three is understanding that Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. And I think those three pieces of knowledge as basic things can help a Jewish student or a Jewish person feel more secure in their own knowledge, their own identity, and their own space, whether that's at university or at work.
Do we have any more questions?
I've got a question. I think the Jewish community was pretty successful in challenging the Labour Party on its anti-Semitism, although it's still an ongoing issue. Do you think that's an example of Jewish pride, and also the campaign against anti-Semitism keeps its head up? Do you think these are examples of showing that rather than putting our heads down, if we put our heads up, we can make a difference?
Absolutely. And although I keep saying that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem, what we have to fundamentally know is that we're allowed to advocate for ourselves. And actually not even allowed, we have a right to advocate for ourselves. So the fact that we as a community came together, saw the threat, identified the threat, understood it, and then most importantly, would not stop talking about it. And I know, as well as you, there are many millions of people in Britain who would love for us to be quiet. Okay, you talked about it, you've said it once, enough. But we didn't. People like Judith did unbelievable work and we didn't stop talking about it. And I think that is a fundamental part of Jewish pride, because we're constantly told, your experience isn't as important as other people. Don't talk about it now. Well, when is the right time to talk about it? When we're facing an existential threat? It was a shining example not only of understanding our right to advocate for ourselves, but also our understanding of community. Look at the American Jewish community. I had a launch there this morning, Hong Kong time, and there was some very high profile people there. And even then I was told, left-wing anti-Semitism is not important. It's only about right-wing anti-Semitism. And people who believe otherwise are wrong. And you see a real partisanship, a real split. The Orthodox don't talk to the Reform, the secular don't talk to anyone else. We overcame all of those issues. And I think that's a shining example of Jewish pride. And we really are a model of Jewish pride to the rest of the diaspora and Israel, of course.
We have a question from Michael Kellyan, who says it's a thought-provoking talk, thank you, and that Wimbledon should get the book. And he would like your thoughts on how we keep young people interested in staying culturally Jewish.
I think that offering people a different route to the same thing. Like, people always say to me, do you believe in God? And I maybe shouldn't be saying this to a synagogue congregation, but I honestly don't ever think about it. I don't even know. It is unimportant to me. But even if you do believe in God, the things that we do are probably the same. As I said, I say Kaddish for my father. Every time I went to Auschwitz and the other camps connected to the Holocaust, I would say Kaddish. And Kaddish, as we know, is about exalting God's name. It doesn't actually say anything about the dead. It's all about God. And I think showing Jewish people, whether they're young or not, that actually you don't need to be religious to engage in this practice. You don't need to be religious for these rituals to be meaningful to you. And I think actually, not only is that more inclusive, it's also more rooted in historical authenticity. And this notion of us as a people, as well as a religion and other things.
I'm just going to ask a question on behalf of Liat, and then I'm going to, and then Judith wants to ask a question. And she said, thank you for your powerful talk. In a world where anti-Semitism is hardly recognized as a form of racism, do you think we could one day achieve getting anti-Semitism in school books as a place on the curriculum? Would you involve promoting such demand among the Jewish community?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it absolutely is a form of racism. And I saw someone on Instagram the other day say it wasn't, and I was appalled because of course it's a form of racism. And I do think it should be taught. I think it should be taught in the same way that anti-Black racism is taught. You know, we're having lots of conversations now about anti-Black racism and decolonizing curriculum and all of these things. And actually, they should also include Jews. And it shouldn't just be Holocaust education. And we see a lot. People say, we need to teach more about the Holocaust. And actually, I think that we don't necessarily need to teach more about the Holocaust. We just need to A, teach the Holocaust better, and we B, need to make sure that the Holocaust is put in its proper context, which is the history of anti-Semitism. I teach a 3-month class on the Holocaust, and we always say to the students, when should we begin? And they give the usual like 1918, 1933, and we say, well, we're going to begin in 380 CE. And their jaws hit the floor. And actually, you could begin at thousands of years earlier. It's so important that it's taught properly. And absolutely, we deserve to be seen. But the problem is that, like David Baddiel has just said in his book, and like I say in mine, is that we're not included in anti-racist policies. We're not included in that world. So when people talk about decolonizing the curriculum, they're meaning to include a very specific group of people. And in my school, we're decolonizing our curriculum now. And I had to say, well, if we're going to teach all these things, then we have to also teach Jewish history. It's just as relevant to Hong Kong as Black history is, or Indian history. And I think fundamentally, one of the most important things about education is training the educators. It's all very well a curriculum being given to someone, but if they don't actually understand the issues at play, it won't be successful.
Thank you, Ben. Judith, would you like to ask your question, and then followed by Jeremy Brown?
Hi all, lovely to see you all. And can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Good. It's 2 parts actually. One is Jewish shame, the shame felt by some Jews. I've had to fight it forever, and I've practiced getting better. When other Jews behave badly, Jews can feel ashamed. That's first part. I'd like you to talk about that, of overcoming that. And of course, the second part is anti-Semitic Jews. For instance, Jewish Voice for Labour, Jewish Voice for Peace in the US, who I seem to be able to take anti-Semitism in my stride, I've learned. But when Jews are anti-Semitic, it causes exquisite pain, unlike any other.
Yeah, I think there are really 2 incredibly important points. I would say one regarding embarrassment of Jews who have done wrong things or whatever is, we're not a monolith. And I remember someone once asked me, I was in Poland on a trip, and one of the 15-year-old Scottish kids said to me, do you think, and it's quite an odd question, but I think it says something quite interesting. They're like, do you think all of the Jews who were murdered were nice? And I was like, well, I mean, there were 6 million of them, so probably not, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they were nice or not, they shouldn't have been murdered. We're not a monolith. We don't need to all behave well. We don't need to be good Jews to be accepted. So while, yes, it can be quite embarrassing when a high-profile Jew is involved in a scandal, or when someone involved in a scandal happens to be Jewish, that is just as likely to happen to our community as any other. And I think that we would feel shame, perhaps other communities would feel shame, but I certainly don't think that the white British community would feel shame with regards to white British people who do bad things. And we shouldn't either. And what you were saying is really important. It involves work. It's something that we have to fight and actively fight. And yes, in recent years, we've had Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein, and what they did was terrible. But A, they didn't do those things because they were Jewish. And their Jewishness also doesn't prevent them from doing those things. People can be good or bad or anywhere in between. And I think that we as a community need to understand that we're also just people. So even when we're talking about our own issues, homophobia, misogyny, anti-Black racism, whatever it is, every community suffers from their version of those problems. We're no better or no worse than anyone else. And then with regards to your second point, I think that what we have to fundamentally recognize is that they're victims. And actually they hate it when we say this as well, because it kind of involves some pity, but they are. Anti-Semitism is systemic, it's institutional, it's deeply embedded, and they have absorbed it. And it's not actually their fault. However, what becomes their responsibility is when they weaponize their Jewish identity against us. And it's incredibly frustrating. You know, a Jewish Voice for Labour were brought on all the TV shows, and they were kind of framed as this other voice in the Jewish community, even though they're a tiny fringe community within our community. But I think it's similarly to what we said before about naming it. We have to name it. They're suffering from internalized anti-Semitism. And the reality is, there's probably a lot of people who feel that way, like, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, Jewish Voice for Labour, who are beyond redemption. But we need to learn from their experience and guard against it for future generations. And I think that even simply naming it, someone came for me yesterday and my publishers, and they were like, "You're a right winger." And I'd said like, "Oh, it's really sad when Jews have internalized anti-Semitism." And it doesn't necessarily shut them up, but it makes it very clear. Like, I know what this is. I know what you're dealing with, and actually you're a victim. And it doesn't necessarily make it any less painful, but I do think that naming it has power.
We have Jeremy Brown had a question. You might need to unmute yourself.
Ben, I'd like to say that was the most passionate and most interesting talk. When you talk about internalized anti-Semitism, which was your last comment, there's also a lot of internalized anti-Zionism. And I, for one, certainly get frustrated at Jews that criticize Israel. I'm a great believer in Dennis Prager. So again, if you haven't followed Dennis Prager, he's one to follow. But I have walked your path, I have to say. I was at university from 82 to 85 in the UK. I was at university also with a lot of anti-Semitism. We had Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon. We do have to stand up as a people. And I don't think that anti-Semitism from inherently institutionalized Labour Party, I don't think the Labour Party is institutionally anti-Semitic. It has its problems, but it was great to see the chief rabbi speak up with everybody else. We were united. What I think needs to be done, and again, you're much more conversant in lecturing and educating, the bias is from the media. It's prejudice and it's ignorance. So we have organizations like Advocacy for Israel, David Collier, Gideon Falter does a great job with Campaign for Anti-Semitism. I think we need to get a spokesperson for Israel out there so we can stand up against the likes of the BBC, Orla Guerin, the Foreign Office, CNN. Anti-Semitism has to start from education. So I admire your passion. You know, I'm well behind you. I couldn't write a book and I couldn't lecture like you, but I'm a staunch Zionist. We also need to get non-Jewish people to speak up for us. Because as you said, if Jews speak up, people will say, oh, the Jews would say that. People like Colonel Richard Kemp, a great guy. Anyway, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to buy you a book. And I haven't really got a question, but I hope my points have come across.
Thanks, Jeremy. We have Ella and David. Apparently you had your hands up. Sorry, I didn't see. If you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to. I agree. I thought that was a lovely talk. My question is this, that when a Jewish person in this country does something, whether it's good or bad, and it's reported in the press, it is almost always reported that he is Jewish. When he does something good and he's reported, we can feel the pride in it. But when it's something bad and he's Jewish, like it was said before, we feel upset. How can we stop the press writing in the paper Jewish, which is totally irrelevant to what is written in the paper, because that Jewish part of it is referred to essentially as the religion, I think, rather than being part of the nationality?
I think it's a really great question, and I'm afraid to say I actually don't think we can. I think there's certain things that we have to accept and not accept in a way that's like, oh, well, but I think that one of the points I make in the book is that actually we cannot necessarily control how they talk about us. We can advocate for ourselves. We can, of course, our leadership can say that actually we prefer you didn't say this. But I think that Luciana Berger was quite an interesting example of this. She said, I never thought that I was going to be referred to as a Jewish MP. But actually, what's wrong with being a Jewish MP? It doesn't mean that she's any less British. I think that part of it is that we associate this hyphenated identity as being, we're slightly embarrassed about it. But actually, a Black British person, perhaps maybe they wouldn't say a Black British, but they might say a Muslim, a Pakistani. I personally don't have a problem when they say British Jewish as an idea. But yes, I agree with you that it can be used also to increase anti-Semitism, to further demonize Jewish people, because I think more often than not, it isn't positive when they're talking about us. You know, Jeremy Corbyn's famous Epstein comment was an example of that, you know, emphasizing someone's Jewishness. We can absolutely advocate for ourselves, and part of Jewish Pride is doing that. But I think another part is really just allowing it to, you know, brush off our backs. There's certain things we're not going to be able to control. And I think fundamentally recognizing that anti-Semitism is not actually our problem is part of recognizing that there's certain things we can't control, but we can control how we respond to it. And in certain ways, we can advocate for ourselves. So maybe the Board of Deputies could be putting out press releases or having meetings with the press officers of the BBC and saying, listen, we prefer you didn't say this, but also simultaneously, we shouldn't let them make us feel ashamed. So Jeffrey Epstein was Jewish. Like, it doesn't...
Yeah, they never write Christian when it happens, do they?
No, you're right. And you're right. And listen, as a Scottish person, we see this too. When Andy Murray is winning, he's British, and when he's losing, he's Scottish. So I understand that. Yeah, you're right. But that's also one of the things about being a minority, right? We're not treated the same as the majority.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Okay, we have Dan Steiner, is it?
Yes, that's right. Hi. Thanks, Ben. Thanks very much. Really, really interesting talk. My question is around the word pride. And it was something I hadn't considered from the point of view of a movement in the similar way to, I mean, obviously that word is very much associated with the LGBT community. But what I find interesting is when you go back 30 years, the LGBT community was vilified, especially during the HIV/AIDS crisis, which we've had very much highlighted recently with the series It's a Sin. Now, obviously back then, LGBT, there weren't many rights, there weren't many laws protecting us, whereas there are for being Jewish. How do we turn this round now that we can, like the LGBT community have done, is to make being gay something actually that's quite a positive thing now, compared to, as you say, with Judaism, it's almost that we need to feel shame, but that hasn't actually now, you know, that's changed now with the LGBT community. So how do we do this to make Jewish pride actually something that people can get behind?
I think it has to come from within. I think it involves us celebrating our identity, celebrating the diversity in our experience. So talking about the religious, the people, Zionism, having these kinds of events. And, you know, somebody once said to me, okay, so with Jewish pride, would we have a pride float? Like, would Jews get on floats and be waving Israeli flags? And I was like, well, no, and I don't think we need that, because actually we have pride festivals every Shabbat, every Rosh Hashanah, every Shavuot. We have these things built into our calendar that I think they're the things for us to latch onto. But I think ultimately it's about having conversations. It's about the Jewish press getting behind this idea of empowering Jewish people. It's also reframing Jewish experience. There's a problem when all we do is talk about anti-Semitism, because what is that teaching people? That we're defined solely through anti-Semitism? No, that's something that's happened to us. But we have unbelievably rich cultures that have survived thousands of years. And actually, that's really cool. And I think reframing our historical experience into something positive, whilst of course recognizing the realities we experience, is vitally important. But it is work. And the LGBTQ plus community has done a huge amount of work. And it is only now, 30 or 40 or so years later, we're really seeing RuPaul's Drag Race and It's a Sin kind of on the mainstream. But and I don't think that our pride will look the same as theirs, but it's work that we have to begin. And we start it by having these conversations and simply asking everyone in this space, have you ever felt ashamed of being Jewish? Have you ever felt embarrassed? And if you have, that's great for you, but I think that's quite rare. And that's okay if you have, because we're Jews and we're a tiny ethno-religious minority living in an anti-Semitic world. but it's about unpacking these things and processing it and having the conversation and offering space to talk about it, while simultaneously having celebrations and, you know, offering people different routes to being proud in their Jewishness, I think.
Right, I think we're going to finish off now with the rabbi asking a question, if that's okay.
Thank you. I also put it into the chat. So as also a former Netzer Bogrim, so a question to you, thinking about your Netzer experience. And what I saw in the past years is that Netzer more and more started to adopting terminology from the so-called left or from the anti-Zionist groups within the left. For example, speaking about the West Bank as the occupied territories. And my question to you is, do you think that Netzer has dropped a little bit its Zionist identity, so it is the Reform Zionist Youth Movement, or are they ducking away from a difficult or uncomfortable conversation, or what's happening there?
I cannot speak with certainty about what they've done, but I can kind of make comments on it. And I think it's this idea that to be considered to be progressive, there's certain official party lines we have to toe. And there's certain, even if you identify, and this is part of, I guess, qualifying Zionism, that often people in the progressive world have to say, well, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but, where actually it should be I'm Zionist, full stop. I'm Jewish, full stop. And I think what they're doing is essentially trying to be good Jews. And they're trying to say, well, you know, listen, we're Zionist, but we don't agree with this, we don't agree with that, look. And I think that is something we see a lot with individuals and with organizations. And I think that it's something, again, I can't speak specifically to what they've done, but hearing kind of what you're saying, that's what it seems to me. And it's an irresponsible thing to do. They, as an organization, a progressive organization, in fact, should be willing to stand up. Anyone should be willing to stand up and say, I'm a Zionist, full stop. Here's why I'm a Zionist. I also support Palestinian right to self-determination. But I think that the I'm Zionist, but, which this appears to be, is kind of an expression of shame, really, isn't it? It's embarrassment. It's not wanting to fully own the term. It's being embarrassed by being a Zionist, as opposed to shedding and rejecting that anti-Semitism. It seems like they've absorbed it.
Right. Do we have any more questions? I think we're ready to wind up right about now. I can't see any more hands. I'd like to thank Judy again for organising this wonderful talk, and thanks for Ben for giving us your evening. And Judy, would you like to say something?
Thank you to you, Alex, because I think it was your suggestion and it was an excellent suggestion. And maybe we just all need to think about how we can be more proud about who and what we are. And the fact even that we've got 5,000 years of history, which is something amazing to hang on to. Maybe it's something we need to imbue our children with, that desire not only to be proud, but to get out there and be proud. So thank you, Ben, for giving such a great example of how to do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.